Okay, we are live. Beth, if you could take care of the housekeeping items, that would be great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brandon.
Oh.
Or Corey,
Yes, I
did you
can
want to
if you
jump
want.
in? Yeah,
Yep.
go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Welcome to the Family History Library's celebration of National DNA Day, which was yesterday. Our next class is titled Grouping DNA Matches, and it's being presented by Beth Taylor. This class is being live streamed. You will be able to review a recording of this class on the Family History Library Facebook page for a limited time, and later in the DNA Basics Learning Center from rootstech.org. We will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. Please post your questions in the chat or comments as we near the end of the presentation. If you are on Zoom and would like to have your questions and comments seen by everyone, please make sure your chat messages are set to panelists and attendees. If you have a specific research problem, whether or not it relates to DNA, we encourage you to sign up to meet one-on-one with one of our research specialists in a virtual genealogy consultation. Go to the Family History Library's website or search virtual genealogy consultations on the FamilySearch wiki. We want to remind you that there is a lot of great content about DNA available from rootstech.org, especially in the DNA Basics Learning Center. To access the DNA Basics Learning Center, go to rootstech.org, click Expo Hall at the top right, and then scroll down to the bottom of the page to the section titled Featured Booths. Let me introduce our presenter for this class, Beth Taylor. Beth works as a United States and Canada research specialist at the Family History Library. She holds a bachelor's degree in history from Brigham Young University and has worked for FamilySearch for 15 years. Her specialties and interests include Quakers, DNA, land records, probate records, organizing, and more.
Thanks, Corey. So far today, we've gotten some background on DNA, what it is, why we use it. The next class, we want to talk a little bit about the processes that you follow in order to actually start working with your DNA matches. So Corey mentioned that we have ethnicity results, and we also talked about how you have, DNA matches. That we're going to focus on the DNA matches, and today most of the focus is going to be on autosomal DNA matches because that's really where we want to spend most of our time. Most people have done autosomal tests, but they're not quite sure what to do with the results. What do you do with all of that information that you get? So we're going to talk a little bit about why we group our DNA matches. Just a second. I'm not sure why my screen is doing something weird. Sorry about that. Okay, so as we mentioned, you're able to see my screen, I hope. Let me know if that's not the case. As we kind of talked about before, and as Lynn demonstrated with the jelly genes, you get DNA, you get a combination of DNA from your ancestors. So if you had 8 great-grandparents who had this kind of DNA, it gets passed down to you, each generation getting kind of mixed up and merged together with the DNA from other ancestors. Now, the big value with DNA is when we compare it with somebody else's DNA and we see what's common. So you have DNA, your second cousin has DNA. Where are the matches? What is overlapping? So that's kind of the foundation, just as a kind of a review, that you inherited DNA, and DNA is valuable when we compare it. Now, as you start working with your DNA matches, especially your autosomal DNA matches, there are 2 key processes that you'll want to follow. One of them is called clustering, which is what we're going to talk about right now, or grouping DNA matches, and the other is determining relationships. And as we go through both of these processes today, you'll see that they really go hand in hand. You'll kind of work with them back and forth, but we're going to teach them separately. So right now I'm going to cover clustering, and then first this afternoon after lunch, we'll talk about determining relationships. So again, we'll start with the clustering, or as we called it, grouping your DNA matches. So today our objectives, we're going to explain the basics of clustering, what exactly is clustering, We're going to walk through the clustering process, and we'll explore some resources that can help you with clustering. We'll talk about a few unique clustering situations. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to isolate matches using clusters to isolate the matches from, let's say, a third great grandmother or wherever your research goal is. And then we're going to introduce a clustering example that we'll continue solving later on in the determining relationships class. Sound good? So let's get started with some basics about clustering. So the first thing that I want to kind of answer is, why are we clustering? Why even bother grouping your matches, doing anything with your matches? The first thing I want to ask you is this question. How many of you have ever, you've taken a DNA test? I'm hoping that you've had that opportunity. If not, well, when you get your test results back, see if you can figure out how many matches you have. But how many matches do you have? And when I say a match is an individual identified by a DNA company as somebody who shares DNA with you. So a match is unique to the person who took the DNA test. So my matches are not your matches. Your matches are not my matches, so there might be some overlap. So they are unique to the test taker itself. So everybody once you take a DNA test, and the reason we talk about just these 5 DNA companies is they're the ones who provide matches and match lists. There's a lot of other companies out there that will test ethnicity or provide haplogroups for Y and mitochondrial, but really we're focusing on those that provide these match lists. But how many matches do you actually have? So I thought I would go find out how many matches I have. So I checked on Ancestry. I have 62,000 matches. My Heritage, I have almost 12,000 matches. Family Tree DNA, 5,000, 5,500 matches. 23andMe, 1.5 thousand matches. Now think about all of those matches. How do you keep them organized? So why do we group matches? Well, first off, it's going to help you organize them so that you know not only who they are, but you can start sorting them into different families. Well, that group of matches belongs to that line, and that group of matches belongs to that line. And why is that important? Well, oftentimes you have a specific research goal in mind. I'm trying to use DNA to solve this problem in my tree. I saw a couple of those questions earlier. Well, I don't know who my paternal grandfather is. Well, the very first thing we're going to suggest that you do is this process of clustering so that we can focus just on the matches related to your paternal grandfather. So this idea is that we're going to create clusters of DNA matches. And a cluster is just a group of DNA matches which appear to relate through the same ancestral line. Okay, so kind of what is clustering? What are we actually doing with clustering? And this I've met with a number of people through virtual consultations, or when the library was open in the last year, I would sit down and I would try and help people understand what to do with their DNA matches. And I feel like clustering is sometimes one of those things that takes a little bit of time to really understand exactly what we're talking about. So hopefully this will help explain a little bit what clustering is. So remember, we kind of talked about the idea that you have DNA and that your DNA is inherited, and that your cousin, let's say you have a second cousin, also has DNA. And now in this example, you can just look where the colors overlap and you say, oh, there's the overlapping colors, and I know how we're related, and that's great. However, that's not what the DNA company gives you. They don't give you, colored segments and tell you, well, this segment comes from your second great grandmother. What they're telling you is that you have DNA, and this person over here, we're going to call him Bob because Bob's such a good name. Bob also has DNA. And the DNA company says, the two of you are a match. The two of you share DNA in common. The two of you have shared DNA, so therefore we think you're related. So they say you're a match. They're going to provide a number of centimorgans. How many centimorgans do you share in common with each other? And the higher the number of centimorgans, the closer the relationship is, the basic theory here. And so then the company says, we predict that at 308 centimorgans is a unit of measurement. That's the best way to describe it for our purposes anyway. They say, we think you might be a second to third cousin. Now, it's up to you, or it's up to the person doing the test or trying to figure things out to then figure out, well, okay, so who really is Bob and how am I related to him? And we'll talk about more how to do that later this afternoon. But maybe you say, okay, I know Bob. Bob's a known person. You know, we spent time together at family reunions when I was growing up. And I know that our common ancestors were named James and Sarah, and this is how we're related. So James and Sarah had children named Margaret and Steve. Margaret had a son named Sam. Steve had a daughter named Sharon. Sam's your father. Sharon's Bob's mother. So that makes, you know, I like drawing out descendancies to figure out relationships. We'll talk more about that again later this afternoon, but that makes you second cousins. So you share DNA. You've decided that you're second cousins, and the 308 seems like a good number. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Now that you kind of know who Bob is and you know your relationship to him, let's take a look at, kind of take a step back, and let's say that you could look at all of your matches. So here's kind of all of my matches, all 62,000 of them. Not really, but here's kind of an example of, you know, here's all my matches. So I have a group of matches, each dot representing another person who's taken a DNA test with whom I share some DNA. And Bob has also taken a test and also has a group of DNA matches that he shares DNA with. Now, what happens if we compare my list of DNA matches and his list of DNA matches? Do we get any overlap? And the answer is that yes, we should, because we are second cousins, we should have shared matches or matches in common. And if we kind of do a Venn diagram, we can highlight that group, that subgroup of matches, and we say these are people that are related to me and are related to Bob. So what are we concluding because they're related to both of us? Well, if Bob and I are related to James and Sarah, we are concluding that the people in this group, that the people in this cluster are also somehow connected to James and Sarah. Now, we're not saying they're descendants of James and Sarah, but we're saying that they are somehow, that they are descendants of one of or some of James or Sarah's ancestors. So we don't really know which line, but because they're sharing DNA with me and they're sharing DNA with Bob, we're going to guess that they are related somehow on that line, in those lines, James and Sarah's lines, who are second or who are great grandparents. So from there, we're going to label that whole group. Now, I could label it the James and Sarah group, or to make life a little bit easier, I could also just name it the Margaret group, because Margaret's the daughter, but she has all the same ancestors that James and Sarah do. So it makes it a little bit easier just to name it after Margaret. So James and Sarah are the common ancestors. Margaret is who we're going to name the match after, and then we might give Margaret a color and color code those matches, saying that they belong to Margaret, that they're somehow biologically related to Margaret. So this is kind of the basic idea behind clustering. So you look at all your matches, and you don't do it, actually the DNA company does it for you, looks at all your matches and all the matches of somebody else and says, here's the overlap. These are the people that are in both groupings. And as you kind of work through, you can start building clusters for each of your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so forth. You can start sorting your matches into the buckets of which ancestor they relate to, which is going to be helpful down the road as you're trying to set up a research project. Now, we're not going to go that far to in these classes, though you're going to see some examples of that in the case studies this afternoon. Okay, so let's actually walk through the process of clustering. I'm hoping you're understanding a little bit more of the idea behind clustering, exactly what you're doing. But let's look into that process itself. So the clustering process is you're going to choose a known match. So this is somebody that you already know, you know your relationship to them. So you really want to build your clusters off of known relatives. We'll talk in a few minutes about what do you do if you don't know any relatives And then you're going to view the shared matches or in common with matches, depending on which website you're using. Each website has their own terminology. And then you're just going to create a cluster, meaning you're going to kind of establish a group. This group of people all seem to share DNA with each other. So meaning that they're showing up on the match lists of other people. Then you add all of those shared matches into your cluster, and then you repeat. Now, if you're building a cluster around a specific ancestor because you're trying to figure out their parents and you're hoping the DNA matches might help you with that, then you want to repeat for everybody within the cluster, because just because of the way what you inherit and what your cousin inherits in terms of DNA and what the matches inherit, you need to run several layers of shared matches. So I'm going to kind of demonstrate this by using Ancestry, just because, and we'll actually show you why, is because of one of Ancestry's features. They've actually built a really awesome feature or tool that allows you to kind of build your groups on the website itself. So here's Ancestry, and here are some of my matches. So we're starting with me. And I'm just going to start with my top match. So we're just going to call him, it is a him because the little icon is blue, is match number 1. Now match number 1 is predicted to be a first to second cousin. He and I share 1,146 centimorgans. Again, we'll talk a little bit later this afternoon about what that number actually means and how we can figure that out. Notice that the Ancestry is actually telling me that they think he's on my mother's side. Now, how is Ancestry making this conclusion? What exactly is happening that led him to this conclusion? Well, the answer is it's because my mother took a DNA test. So Ancestry isn't going to predict which side of the family, at least not right now, unless you have that parent having taken a DNA test. And since I have tested both my mother and my father, when I look at my matches, Ancestry tries to split them into mother's matches and father's matches for me. Excuse me, which is great. Sorry about that. I seem to be losing my voice. Okay, now I know who this match is. He happens to be my first cousin. So I knew it because of his name, which I'm not showing or sharing with you, but because of his surname, I know it's my mother's sister's son, which works perfectly for what we're trying to do. Which means that I can build a cluster around this match that should be my maternal side. Now, like I said, Ancestry kind of already does this for me because it's saying it's mother's side and it will split that for me. But I want to show you the process of doing this. So in case you weren't able to test your mother, or maybe you're doing like I oftentimes when I work and try and sort out my matches, I do it, my mother's matches or my father's matches, I'll actually work with their tests as opposed to my own. But I wanted to show you from my perspective. So in this case, I am going to label these as maternal matches because the common ancestor for me in this match are my grandparents. However, that's through my mother, and so that's the focus. Okay, so I go ahead and I click View Match, and I come up with a screen that looks something like this. And the first thing I want to do is I'm going to create the group. Ancestry calls these groups, but I've seen people use this group feature for a lot of things, but I like to use it exclusively for this concept of clustering. So I go ahead and I click Add to Group, and it comes up with a little thing that pretty much says you don't have any groups yet. What do you want to do? And I'm going to create a custom group. Now, if you already have existing groups, there is a way that you could, if you want to start over, you can delete your existing groups, or you can say, no, I've already been clustering, I want to rename them. You can do all of that once you start editing and things like that. So I'll go ahead and create a custom group. It's going to come up with a nice little box that says, what group name do you want? So I'm just going to call this for now mother's side. Oftentimes I'll actually put the name of the ancestor that I'm building the cluster around in the name of the group. However, because we're doing this a little more anonymously, we'll just call it mother's side. And I'm going to go ahead and assign a color. In this case, I'm going to use this light blue color. So you'll notice now I had to go in and add this match, my match number 1, to this group, but now there's a little color-coded icon that says this person is in this group. So I've started the cluster. The next step is to look at the shared matches for me and for this particular match. So there's that little box right near the top that says shared matches. Now remember what this is doing, back to this idea of the Venn diagram. It's saying, here are all my matches, and here are all the matches belonging to match number 1, to my first cousin. And what overlaps are matches that appear on my match list and appear on my cousin's match list. So we're guessing, and it's not always the case, we'll talk a little bit later about this, but we're guessing that all of these people in this overlap are all related on this side of the family. Now, ideally, really, because it's a first cousin, we should have way more overlapping matches, but, you know, creating the, anyway, I just wanted to use the same Venn diagram. So, okay, so once I've clicked shared matches, it's now listing out the matches that we share in common, that my match number 1, my first cousin, and I both have on our match lists. You'll notice that match number 1 was number 1. Where are numbers 2 and 3? Well, 2 and 3 don't relate to me on my mother's side, so therefore they're not showing up as shared matches to my maternal first cousin. So that's why we start with number 4, 5, 6, 8, and so forth. So from there, I want to add the people on this shared match list to my maternal side group, because I'm building this cluster where all of these people somehow relate to me through my mother's side of the family. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to hit the plus icon, or if there's already a group, it's an edit icon instead. And Ancestry recently updated this experience so that it's a little bit easier than it used to be. It used to be that you had to do a lot of checking and expanding and checking and things like that. So now it opens a thing on the side that says, you know, who do you want to add, which group do you want to add to? And you can add more custom groups, and this is where you can edit your groups or do whatever you want, delete groups. And then over on the left side, it adds little check boxes next to the name of each match. So you can just go through and check all the boxes. Now, because I'm, again, building a cluster and I'm viewing shared matches, I'm adding everybody on my list to this cluster. So I had to go through and check every single box, which actually takes a little bit while because there were 661 DNA matches to add to this. So I go ahead and check all the boxes. This is a really good thing to do while you're watching documentaries or something in the background. And then I check that I'm going to add it to my mother's side, to that cluster that I'm building. And then I go ahead and click add to group. Now, one of the things I want you to think about is this, do you remember how many matches on Ancestry I said I had? It was over 60,000 matches. So why am I only, does that mean that 661 of them are maternal and the rest of them belong to my father's side of the family? The answer here is there's a couple of things going on. First off, me and my first cousin do share overlapping DNA, but I could have matches in my match list that come from my mother's side of the family that do not share DNA with my first cousin, which means that I'm going to that I'll probably run into more matches if I can do this with other cousins or with second cousins. I'll be continually adding to this cluster. The other thing, though, that's happening is that Ancestry only displays shared matches with 20+ centimorgans in common, which means that the lower level matches will not be shown when you're doing a shared match list. Okay, so I went ahead and I added them to my group. I come back to the screen, and you'll now notice that all of these matches now have that little same blue icon indicating they belong to that cluster. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of building a cluster using this grouping ability that Ancestry offers, which is a really, really awesome tool that they have. Okay, so the process that we followed, that we're talking about, is to choose a known match, view the shared matches. We did that. We created the cluster. We added the shared matches to the cluster. And then the last step is to repeat. So then we go back and do the next match. And again, you want to work on matches that are known. These are people that you actually know how they're related. So we go back to this is my whole list of matches. This isn't just the ones that I'm sharing with my first cousin. So you'll notice that match number 1 is now in that blue cluster, the maternal side cluster. But there's match number 2. He doesn't appear in any clusters. But he doesn't have a tree. So then I'd want to move on to match number 3, because I need to figure out if match number 3, I need to know how he's related in order to build a good solid cluster around him. And then I can work from there. Or I could work from match number 2, but I really should do match number 3. And you'll notice, again, it says it's father's side because he is somebody on the father's, again, because my father's taken a DNA test, Ancestry is telling me that it comes from my father's side of the family. So if that doesn't appear, that's why. It's just simply because maybe your father can't take a DNA test. Maybe he's no longer living, or maybe he's unwilling to, or whatever or you don't know who he is. You just won't get those messages. Okay, so let's talk about some things that can help with the clustering process. The first thing I want to talk about is, again, that color coding that we were just looking at. Ancestry actually offers 24 different colors, which means that you can create 24 different groups. But one of the things I'd recommend that you do is, if you're going to really, get in and decide to build your clusters this way, which it's an awesome thing to do, but is that you plan. You don't just kind of start and say, well, this one's my third great grandmother over here. Set up a system of how you want to build your colors and how you want to use them, and exactly how you're going to do this. One of the more common ones I've seen lately is where, well, we'll talk about that, and I think I just have a slide on that. So make sure that you are incorporating all sides of your family, so you don't have like one maternal match, for all of your mother's side, and the rest of them are for your father's side. Unless you really are never going to work on the matches on your mother's side and you have no research goals there, then yeah, maybe that would work. You could, isolate out the mother's side and work on your father's side. But really do consider how to incorporate matches from all your ancestors, and not just a few lines. So if you plan ahead, then you'll know which colors go with which people. Also remember that starred matches are now being used pretty much like an additional group, which kind of gives you 25 groups that you can create. I personally like to use starred matches to indicate which matches I actually have proven my relationship to. I know how we're related, as opposed to, and everyone uses different matches differently, but just think it's another grouping that you are creating. But for me, I like to just say, okay, it's a starred match. It means I've actually figured out the relationship. So here's an example of a way that you could color code, where you kind of assign a color to each ancestor up to your great-grandparent level, and then at great-great-grandparents, you might be reusing some colors. You kind of have to figure out how you're going to do that. But if you plan ahead, then you know which color to use for which line. And then the way that this is being adapted, and I really like this, and I've just been implementing this for my own tree, is that once I've proven a match is, my paternal side, then that match gets the paternal color. And then if I prove that it comes from my father's father, I actually add in a second color. So the second color tells me that not only is this on my father's side, it's on my grandfather's side. And then if I added a third color, it would tell me it was on my great-grandfather's side. So this kind of color coding system allows you to really start organizing your matches in a visual way, so that you can actually look at the colors associated, the clusters, in a way associated with a person, even before you know how they're related to you, because of the shared matches and building the cluster. You can say, well, I know that person is probably on my maternal great-grandfather's side, just by looking at it. So here's an example. What if you ran in, if you were doing something like I just showed you, and you run in, as you're skimming your matches, you can actually figure out relationships placed, or probable relationships based on the clusters that they belong to. So if this were the colors that somebody had that were attached to one of your matches, and these are the colors that you're using, and you'll notice I ended up numbering my clusters so that they would be listed in the order I wanted them to be listed. But you can play around with how you want to organize your clusters. But if this is a match that is in my father's, belongs to my father, to both of his parents and to all of his grandparents, so to my father's parents and his grandparents, think about that. Who is that? Now you'll notice that this person is not in any of my mother's clusters, which means that it's related. Probably this is a first cousin or a first cousin once removed or somebody down that line. So if you get your color coding organized, you can actually scan your match list and easily, figure out relationships. You could get a brand new match who you don't know who it is because they didn't include a tree and they have one of those really vague usernames, and look exclusively at the clusters and say, oh yeah, that's a cousin or a cousin removed or something like that. They belong about here in my tree, just based on their colors. And like I said, I like to use the star to indicate known. So this is actually the color coding for a first cousin, for a known first cousin. So again, we could do the same thing with a lot fewer clusters that they belong to. In this case, if they were in the father's cluster, the paternal grandmother's cluster, and I think I've got the wrong colors there. And then one generation back, again, you can use the color coding to kind of give you a sense of where the match must be related to you without having any other information about them. And this could be really helpful. Maybe you have somebody who reaches out to you one day and says, I was adopted and I want to figure out how I'm related. And you just go and look at their shared matches and figure out, well, you're probably on this line and maybe this far back based on a couple of other things. Okay, another great tool or resource are auto clusters. Auto clustering is a process where a company or a tool will actually build your clusters for you. This is an example of an auto cluster that came from MyHeritage. This is my auto clustering off of MyHeritage. MyHeritage offers this, and it's actually based off of the tool that Genetic Affairs put together, from my understanding. Genetic Affairs is a kind of they don't have DNA data. They're not one of our major DNA companies, but they do have a lot of great resources. And this auto clustering is really awesome that they do. And Genetic Affairs works with, will auto cluster, I think Family Tree DNA and 23andMe and I think Living DNA at this point. And then GEDmatch also just recently announced that they were working with the gentleman who founded Genetic Affairs, and they are also now offering an auto cluster option, though it is what's called a tier 1 option, meaning it is a subscription service. And then DNA GEDcom also does some auto clustering from what I understand, but again, it's more of a subscription. Usually it might cost you a little bit of money to do some auto clustering. But when somebody builds your clusters for you, then you've got your clusters already, and then you can go through and figure out how they're related to you or to each other, whatever the project you're working on. Another way of clustering is something called the leads method. This is another way of using the shared matches, but in this case, you use a spreadsheet to kind of represent those shared matches within their clusters. So this is an example using grandparent clusters. This is pretty much the traditional way of starting the leads method. And then, you can try and split out those grandparent clusters into great grandparents and so forth. But again, you write all of your matches on the left side of the sheet, and then as you do the shared matches, you can say, okay, these people all seem to be grouping here. I notice they're all showing up on each other's match lists, and so I'm assuming that they belong to the red cluster or the green cluster or whatever cluster colors you're using. And if you check the wiki page, I actually gave you some links to a couple of resources that further describe the leads method, including the entire page from the leads method was created by Dana Leeds, I believe her first name is, and she has an entire blog dedicated to the leads method and how it works. So if you want to learn more about the leads method, I would take a look at that. Now, you may also just end up having to use spreadsheets to do your clustering regardless of whether you choose to do it with the leads method or not, or you do a variation of the leads method, spreadsheets are going to be helpful, especially for the websites that don't have nice grouping options like Ancestry, but you still need to use and work with their matches. So remember that Ancestry is not the only one that has a shared matches option. So Ancestry has its shared matches. MyHeritage, again, calls shared DNA matches, is what they refer to them as. 23andMe calls them relatives in common. Family Tree DNA has options to either do in common with or not in common with. They're the only company that has the not in there, which is an interesting way of looking at it, especially if you tested one parent but couldn't test the other, and so you want to see who's not in common with the one parent. And then Living DNA calls it relatives in common. So sometimes we'll refer to these as shared matches or in common with, because that's pretty much covers the range of the 5 companies. Now, because a lot of these tools don't have something like the grouping option, that's when spreadsheets are going to become very helpful, where you're going to write out matches and try and group them yourself, or you're going to try and auto cluster using like Genetic Affairs or one of the other tools. So the other great thing about spreadsheets is that you might need to track your matches and build your clusters across companies, because it's possible, you're working on an unknown father, maybe you're helping a friend who didn't know who her biological father was, and she's tested with 3 of the different companies, and you are starting to build clusters for her father on all the companies. You might need to start comparing that information from the different websites. And so that's when something like a spreadsheet or a table, you're going to want to keep track of things. And again, kind of going back to this idea, if you have 60,000 matches, how are you really keeping track of things? If you're not, whether it's through spreadsheets or something, you have to kind of keep on top of it. Just like we keep research logs with traditional research, you got to keep some kind of notes, or I love spreadsheets, so spreadsheets with your DNA matches. So let's talk about some unique clustering situations that you might run into. First off is probably one of the big ones, is what do you do when you actually don't have any relatives to cluster around? So maybe you're adopted and you're trying to figure out who your biological parents are. Well, you don't have any known cousins. I mean, you might have matches that look like they're cousins, but you can't say for sure that they're a first cousin, or a first cousin once removed, or a third cousin. So what do you do? Well, you still want to build clusters. You're just gonna start with your top match, view the shared matches, you create that cluster, and as you create the cluster, you might just name them and say, this is unknown cluster number 1, unknown cluster number 2, unknown cluster number 3, depending on how many you have. Or maybe you're working on your father's side, you could call them paternal cluster number 1, paternal cluster number 2. Ideally, you should at least kind of get down to 4 clusters, but depending on how many close relatives you have tested, some of those clusters, you might actually have smaller clusters that are more like great-grandparent clusters, but you can at least get to that point where you have these individual clusters. And then we'll talk about later in the determining relationships class, we'll talk about what to do with those clusters. But for now, you at least want to start sorting your matches into buckets, in a way of saying, okay, these people all seem to go together, these people all seem to go together, these people all seem to go together, again, because of the shared match feature. So you mark the cluster as unknown, and again, you add the shared matches to the cluster, and then you're going to take every shared match within the cluster and repeat, because you'll pick up more shared matches for each individual cluster. So again, lots of time just checking boxes and adding people to clusters, but that really is kind of the foundation. Whether it's you're trying to find an unknown parent or you're just trying to organize your matches, you really do need to do this clustering. And I refer to it as cluster. I've also heard it called building genetic networks or grouping your matches. It's all the same kind of concept. The one thing I want you to know is that clustering is dynamic. So every time you identify another known relative, or you identify another person, if you're doing unknown groupings, you identify a person that doesn't fit in another cluster, you want to add them. Every time you get a new match, you want to do their shared matches and say, wait, I look at their shared matches and every single person in their shared matches appears to have DNA shared in common with grandma and with grandpa and his father. So I'm going to mark them and put them into that cluster. So this is something, again, that it's an ongoing process. You keep adding them. Clusters are constantly growing. The other weekend, I started working with my mother's DNA matches, and she has, how many first cousins? She has 3 first cousins that have done DNA testing. So I took her top first cousin, they're all maternal cousins. No, they're paternal. I apologize. They're her paternal first cousins on her father's side. So I took the first one and I did the cluster and I built the whole thing. So I can skip the other 2, right? Well, I took the second one, and about half of the shared matches with the second one were not shared matches with the first one. And the same thing with the third one. The cluster kept growing the more people I did the shared matches with. So make sure that you're letting your clusters grow. Don't just build one cluster off of one cousin. You need to keep building it off of more and more cousins to really make sure you've filled out and gotten all of the matches that belong in that cluster. And eventually you may find yourself working with the below 20 centimorgan match grouping too, especially if you're looking at, a third or fourth or fifth great grandparent. And then, you're going to have to find ways to do more of the reverse, where you pick the person and look at their shared matches and then assign the cluster, because they're not going to show up any other way. As you build out your clusters, so you build your mother's and your father's clusters, and then you try and split them. So you're taking fathers and splitting it into grandma and grandpas. Same with moms. Sometimes that's going to be a little bit tough. For example, if you have situations such as I do, where all of the siblings married each other in the family. So I have one situation where 5 members of one family married 5 members of another family, and another one where it was 3 and 3. And what that means is that sometimes splitting the clusters for the parents is tough, because you can't find, cousins on one side or the other. They're all cousins on both sides because of those double relationships. Or I also have a situation where my great-grandfather was an only child. So I can't find descendants of his siblings known descendants of his siblings. So I might not be able to ever completely split his cluster into his parents. I might have to go back to his grandparents to split that cluster. Okay, a couple other notes. I noticed somebody asked about endogamy. We're not going to talk a lot about endogamy, because endogamy is a really big issue, but there are a couple situations which make clustering almost impossible. Those are endogamy and pedigree collapse are the 2 most known causes of this. Endogamy are situations where a population has been isolated for hundreds of years. This could be a physical isolation, like the Polynesian islands are very, very, very endogamous, or it could be more of a social isolation, where the community is just married within itself, within the community for a long time. The Ashkenazi Jews are well known for this as well. And what that means is that when you try and cluster, it's almost impossible with these groups, because you're just related to everybody in so many different ways that it's all gonna kind of get weird. So endogamy can make things a little bit difficult with clustering, and pedigree collapse can also do that, where, for example, if you ever have the same ancestor appear in your tree multiple times, well, imagine if all of your ancestors appeared in your tree multiple times. I helped somebody once where on 7 of his 8 lines of his great-grandparent lines, people were showing up in various lines, and not just, within one line 3 or 4 times. It was across those 7 lines. And so in his case, clustering is going to be almost impossible because of what that's called pedigree collapse. And then, of course, if you have situations where you just get multiple relationships, you don't quite have endogamy, but you still have this thing where cousins are marrying cousins, or where everybody in the community marries each other. You might have a lot more issues trying to actually tease out and identify your clusters. The boundaries between the clusters are going to get really muddy. So if that happens, then, there's some things that you can do. I actually am, again, on the wiki page, if you look under this section, I linked to a number of different articles written by a lot of the good genetic genealogy blogs out there that have addressed these issues of endogamy and pedigree collapse, and can give you some suggestions on how to move forward if you are running into this in your own family. And then I do want to just kind of touch base on, sometimes we find that there are matches that appear in multiple clusters. meaning that you look at a match and suddenly they're not only in your mother's side of the family, but they're also in your father's side of the family, and you kind of are wondering what's going on. So let's talk a little bit about some of the reasons why a match can appear in multiple clusters and sometimes across your family lines. Well, one big reason is just simply that match might actually descend from a much closer ancestor than it would appear based on their amount of shared DNA. So let me show you kind of an example of this. So my mother has a match, and according to Ancestry, this match is about a 4th to 6th cousin, and this match shares, my mother and this match share 62 centimorgans in common. So it's a lower amount. And so what we would assume then is that the common ancestor should be further back in time. However, as I start clustering, I actually discover that this particular match appears in all of the clusters for my mother's mother, all of them, which means something is going on. How is she appearing in all matches? Because then it would be a first cousin, and 62 centimorgans is really low. Well, in this situation, what it is this is actually an individual who is just a couple generations further removed from the common ancestor. So it actually, they descend from the grandmother like we thought, except it's not a first cousin relationship. And actually in this case, it's a second cousin twice removed. So it's, again, this problem is that it looks like it should be further back in time, but it's really just because it's further down the generations. It's actually later in time, I guess. Back in time, I'm not sure how to describe that. But so that could be one reason why somebody's appearing in a lot more clusters than they should. Another reason is that you can be related to the person in more than one way. And I'm bringing this one up specifically because I've worked with a number of people, and as we start clustering, we run into these matches that will show up in both mom's side and dad's side. So suddenly you have a match that's in both your maternal clusters and your paternal clusters. So for me, the green and the blue are maternal, and the pink and the orange are paternal. What is going on with this person? What does this mean? And I think that a lot of times we jump to this idea that, wait, does that mean mom and dad are related to each other? Well, the answer is no, actually. What we need to do is to kind of examine, how does this happen? And this is actually something that's happened in my own family and my own tree, is that one of the relatives of my father, so my dad's first cousin, actually married a relative of my mother, who was about a third or fourth cousin, a third cousin. So what happens when they marry? Does this mean mom and dad are related? Well, you could call them cousins-in-law, I guess, at that point, but it's kind of a really distant relationship. But it does mean that I'm now going to share DNA with descendants of that relationship. But I'm going to share. I have a shared relationship on both my father's side and my mother's side. So I have two relationships to these people, but it doesn't actually mean that my parents are related at all. It just simply means that one of my dad's relatives married one of my mother's relatives. And then the children, of course, are showing up as DNA matches in a way. And what that means, again, is that those people then show up in both maternal and paternal clusters. And it kind of might, take a pause and say, okay, that happens, especially if you both mom and dad's side came from the same small town, or in this case, some of my dad's, most of my mother's family is from Utah and Arizona, and one of my dad's aunts moved to Utah, and my mother's family, they're big families. It happens. So don't worry if you're seeing that happen. The one thing to note is if a match is appearing in multiple clusters like that, and you can't really figure out why, you kind of have to take that match out. You can't run clusters off that match because you'll pretty much get all of your matches. So again, those are people that you just have to kind of set aside and say, well, I know that they're in more than one cluster, so therefore I'm not going to look at them. And then there could be, this is a little bit more complicated. I'll just call them false positives, for want of a better term. It kind of goes back to this idea that the shared matches are people that are on my match list and on my cousin's match list, but that doesn't mean that they are related, that the three of us are related in the same way. They could be on my match list because they're through my father's side, and then my cousin's on my mother's side, and then they could be also on my cousin's, other side of the family. They're also related, and then they'll show up as a shared match. But the shared match, because of ancestry, it's not looking for overlapping segments, it's just looking for common ancestors on both match lists. Anyway, you can get these, again, what I'm calling false positives. So sometimes this happens, but again, the idea is if they show up in multiple clusters, and unless you can resolve that they, are just a closer relative than you thought, or they descend from a closer ancestor, you kind of have to set them aside and don't use them for clustering purposes. Because again, it'll kind of muddy up your clusters. Okay, next I just want to touch base on what I call isolating matches, and we're going to see this a lot more with the case studies later this afternoon. But I get this question a lot is, I want to know more about this unknown grandfather. How can I build a cluster around him? I don't know him. I don't know anything about him. And the answer is that you can do a process that we're just kind of referring to as isolating the matches. So what we do is we're going to identify clusters of the generations before that person, and then we're going to split the cluster and exclude the matches from the other side of the family. So let me show you what I'm talking about, kind of as a better example. So what if this is your tree and you're looking for dad? Well, we can't look for and build a cluster around dad because we don't know anything about dad. However, we can build a cluster around mom because we do know something about mom. And then once you've built a cluster around mom, you exclude those matches. You isolate the unknown matches. So if we take all of mom's matches and then we set them aside, then what we have left should be dad's matches, the unknown matches. So we're kind of doing it by a process of elimination. Because again, as I'm helping people with this, I was like, well, I don't want to worry about mom because she's not that's not my focus, but you have to cluster around the known relatives in order to exclude them from the case study. So this would leave you again with the paternal matches. Same kind of a thing. Let's say you have this ancestor, Clara, and you don't know Clara's parents, and your goal is to find DNA matches related to Clara. Well, ideally, if you've been building all your clusters out, you'll have already clustered down to her. But if you're like, I just want to jump to Clara, I don't want to have to do all my clusters right now, and I understand it's a lengthy process sometimes. You can again follow this process of isolating matches. So first you try and find all of the matches of your mother, and then you're isolating your mother's side, and then you take all of mom's matches, and now you're going to try and split them into grandma and grandpa and isolate and just focus on grandpa's matches. And then you do that with grandpa's mother, Virginia, and now you have Virginia's matches, the matches that seem to be related to Virginia are further back. And now you take Virginia's matches, and you're going to isolate Jacob's matches. And why are you doing Jacob's matches? Because your focus is Clara. The problem is Clara is unknown because we don't know either of her parents, therefore we can't find known relatives. So we focus on Jacob, isolating Jacob's matches, so we can again exclude Jacob's matches from Virginia's matches, leaving us with Clara's matches. So a little kind of a complicated idea, but this is kind of the foundation of, sometimes focusing in on a second great grandparent or a third great grandparent. One little note, because I've seen this a lot as I've helped people, is there's a kind of tendency to build clusters around surname searches. So we go and say, okay, well, I think that the third great grandmother, the family story always said that her maiden name was, Gray. So I am going to just go and search all of my matches for anybody with the surname Gray in their trees, and that's how I'm going to solve the problem. Well, I worry because I'm not sure that that's exactly the right focus, the right way of doing it. It is possible that you will pick up some people with the surname Gray, and it will guide you in the right direction. But there are a couple things that are happening when you just rely on these surname searches. First off, you're relying on all your matches having complete trees. And as we'll see later this afternoon, a lot of people don't have complete trees. Maybe they don't have Gray in their family yet because they just haven't done much research beyond the grandparent level. And so you're never going to pick them up as a match as somebody who might help you with this case. Or you might have a situation where you have the same surname on different lines. I have the surname, I have the surname Johnson is actually on 3 of my 4 family lines. In addition to that, as I was going through my mother's matches, I realized that she has matches with the surname Johnson who are related on the 4th of my family lines. So in a way, I have her related to Johnsons on all 4 family lines. So if I go searching for Johnson, how do I really know that I'm focusing in on the right family? I could be building a magnificent cluster, just it's not around the family I'm researching. So the other problem with just focusing on doing these surname searches is you're actually missing the other half of the family at every generation. If the surname really was Gray, what's the mother's maiden name? And without that second name, what's happening is you're really kind of narrowing down the people that you're looking at. And that's why really building the clusters, even if people don't have trees, the clusters, is actually just a more efficient way, it's a more organized way of identifying matches related to that unknown line. I'm not saying, I mean, people have success with the surname approach. I just worry that they are missing out on a lot by just doing that surname approach. And that's why I find that it's more efficient to do the clustering than it is to do the surname searches. Okay, so let's do a quick clustering example. And like I said, we'll kind of continue this afternoon. It's a fictional case study in a way. So let's say we have an individual named Emily, and Emily wants to find her biological father. She has some known information about him based on what her mother's provided. We'll look at this a little bit more this afternoon. So Emily looks at all of her matches, and what she needs to do is to isolate her father's matches. Now, can she go out and find a first cousin on her father's side? Well, who knows, maybe she'll have a high enough level, and high enough match that will be a first cousin and she contacts them and it all, but most of the time she's actually going to have to put a little more work in this. So her first step is to try and find and identify her mother's matches so that she can exclude them and focus on the non-mother's matches, which we're going to assume are paternal matches. So she starts and she says, oh, I know who Janet is. She's my first cousin. She's my mother's sister's daughter. So we know she's a first cousin. We can mark her as a first cousin. Her most recent common ancestor, we'll use that term a little bit more this afternoon, are her mother's parents, and we're going to put her in a maternal cluster. So then we take Janet and we look at Janet's shared matches, and we say that Kenneth, Peggy, Dorothy, Nicole, Christina, Daniel, Rebecca, and Elizabeth are all shared matches with Janet. So what does that make us think about these people? Are they maternal matches or paternal matches? So they are probably maternal matches. So we're going to go ahead and mark them all as maternal. And now, because our focus, if the focus is maternal, then we focus on them. If the focus is not, then what we're going to do is we're going to remove them. Now, if you were working with a spreadsheet, you'd probably just mark them in a different color, but since I don't have a lot of space on the screen, we're just going to take them out and focus on the matches that are left. So now Emily has isolated her paternal matches. Now, these are the people that she thinks are related on her father's side, and hopefully we can use them to identify her father. However, the first thing we want to do is to see if we can build some clusters within her paternal matches, because ideally her father should have 2 clusters, the grandfather's cluster and the grandmother's cluster. Or if you can't identify that, maybe further more clusters than that. So she's going to build a cluster just by taking the top match and doing shared matches. So we'll start with Henry is sharing DNA with Joseph, or shared matches are Joseph, Heather, Jerry, Melissa, Kathy, Richard, and Matthew. And then we can mark all of those people as just a paternal cluster. So we'll just call it paternal cluster number 1. And then she does the same thing with Ronald and discovers that everyone else seems to share DNA or be listed on Ronald's match list. And so she puts them all in paternal cluster number 2. So Emily has now clustered her matches, meaning she's now ready to take that next step to try and identify the relationship, or to figure out what's next, so that she can try and figure out who her father is. And again, this is an entirely fictional case. That was the easiest way to kind of present this. But again, she starts by clustering so that she can then take the next step. And like I said, we'll talk about that later this afternoon. Okay, so kind of our conclusion. Clustering is a really, really great way to organize your matches, and a really essential way to organize your matches, especially if you'll stop and think, okay, what am I trying to use my DNA for? What is my hope? What am I trying to solve? What's the case that I'm looking at? And if you cluster and you isolate, then you can actually focus in on the matches for that case, whether that's because it's a third great grandmother or a first great grandfather. You can figure that out. Or maybe you have been contacted by somebody who's adopted and they want to figure out how they're related to you. You creating your clusters can help them. So it's going to let you focus on matches from a specific ancestor. Just remember, these clusters are dynamic. In my the way my process is that I figure out I figure out a match. This is how I know we're related. I run shared matches and add everybody to the cluster. And then I go back and do another match, just on my high level clustering, just to get people organized. The two, you're constantly going to be clustering and adding people into your clusters. And like I said, if you're contacted by a match who's got an unknown parent or a brick wall, how awesome is it if you have clustered well enough where you can say, yep, I think that based on the clusters, you are probably related here. And if you have relatives in this area, I would focus on these 3 families. I mean, your clusters could actually help somebody else as well as yourself. So, okay, back to this idea that we've got the 2 key processes as you work with your DNA matches. You have clustering and you have determining relationships. So we've touched on clustering, and this afternoon at 1 o'clock Mountain Time, we're going to talk about determining relationships. So do we have any questions? And while Corey's getting on, I just want to, now our next class is at 1 p.m. Mountain Time. At 12, however, we're doing a Facebook Live. FamilySearch is hosting a Facebook Live where they're talking to Johnny Pearl, who is the founder and creator and everything for DNA Painter, which is a tool that we will talk about several times this afternoon. So, go grab yourself some lunch. We'll break for lunch in a minute, and then come back. It's not going to be on Zoom. So if you're on Zoom, you'll have to pause that for a second, or, just mute everything. It's going to be Facebook or at the DNA Basics Learning Center. You can go watch that live experience. So just kind of an opportunity to go hear, what Johnny's doing and what's next and what he sees as the future of these, tools. But there's some pretty cool things that he's put out there on DNA Painter. And so, as you eat your lunch, you might want to listen in and see what Johnny has to say. Now, do we have any questions, Corey?
We have a ton of questions. Thank you. Casey from YouTube asks, how does this work when you have common family lines that are on both sides? So we do have a lot of questions about endogamy. So my parents were distant cousins, 4th or 5th.
So I think that's where, building those clusters, it's a little bit harder to do. But like I said, I found some great articles written by like Diane Southard from the DNA Guide, Roberta Estes from DNA Explained, or from the DNA Geek Leah, I want to say her last name is Larkin. I always get her last name wrong. Who've actually written great articles. I think Kitty Cooper, I found one from her as well, who've actually written about endogamy and written about this issue with doubled relationships and pedigree collapse. I would go read what they have to offer. I tried to link to as many of them as I could and put it on that wiki page. So there's a whole section on endogamy and pedigree collapse. Go read what they have to say, because I honestly haven't had as much experience trying to resolve situations with endogamy. I just have a lot of sympathy for those who have these kinds of situations, because your clusters just never quite, well, for really endogamous relationships, you just have one cluster is the real truth. But in these other situations, sometimes your clusters are a little bit more vague, but they might have some ideas on how to approach it better than what my experience has.
Great, thank you. So how can I know if it is the mother, this is from Zoom, or the father? My two parents are dead.
Okay, so I would come back and we're going to talk about determining relationships this afternoon. So we'll talk a little bit about how you figure out if that matches maternal or paternal. But if you don't know, you can still, again, build a cluster around that match. Just you have to call it an unknown cluster because you don't know where it belongs yet.
Great, thanks. From YouTube, is there a way to export your DNA matches from Ancestry to an Excel spreadsheet?
That is such a good question. And I'm trying, there was a Chrome extension that we all used for a long time, but I don't know that it's been updated, and I don't even remember what it's called anymore because I haven't used it in so long. Ancestry itself, at least the last thing I've heard from Ancestry is that there isn't a way within the tool itself. There was, again, this third-party Chrome extension, but it may not work anymore because Ancestry keeps updating itself and the person creating the Chrome extension just couldn't keep up with it. So I don't know that there is. You may end up having to do a lot more hand enter, but go out and see what there is. A lot of these, I've pointed to a couple of these blogs and they are so up to date with what's going on in the DNA community. So, following a couple of them, you might see if anybody else has that idea. Or you might also, for those of you who are on Facebook, there is a really, really great Facebook group that you may want to join called Genetic Genealogy Tips and Techniques. Genetic Genealogy Tips and Techniques. I think I got that right. And that's a good question to go ask them, because if there is a tool right now that would allow you to download your matches, they would know about it.
All right. Susan from Facebook asks, my dad has double cousins where sisters married brothers. How does that complicate the matching process? And I think you somewhat answered that already in your class. So.
Yeah, just a reminder that the children of those double cousins may or may not be useful for clustering purposes. You might just have to set them aside and say, oh, double cousins, we love you, but we can't use you because, too many relationships.
All right. CA from YouTube, can you cluster within a cluster like a subgroup?
Yes, yeah. So the idea is that in a way that you're creating a maternal cluster and a paternal cluster, and then I call it splitting, but you're kind of talking about the same thing of creating subgroups. So then I call it, here's your maternal cluster. Now you're going to split it into the matches related to mom's mom and mom's dad. And hopefully over time, as you can split them further, then your clusters become more refined, then you have more information on your matches.
Okay. Bruce from YouTube asks, for a woman trying to identify paternal ancestry, is the Y-DNA test of any value?
So if a woman's trying to identify her paternal ancestry, if she has a brother who will do a Y-DNA test for her, or her father, or a first cousin who is male, whose father was a brother to her father, then yes, the Y-DNA, she just can't take the Y-DNA test herself. I can't take a Y-DNA test, but I can definitely, I've had my father do it, or I could have had my brother do it. But yeah.
Sonia from Facebook says, so if no DNA for parents can be done, how would I cluster a whole sibling as father line or mother line?
Now, siblings are hard. Anybody who shares all the same ancestors that you do, siblings, nieces and nephews, children, anybody like that, you kind of have to ignore for clustering purposes because they're not going to help you. So a sibling, what I tend to do is if you have a sibling or a child, they end up in all the clusters. I go ahead and add them to the clusters just because otherwise they stand there looking lonely without any colored dots and I feel sorry for them. So I just add them to all the clusters. But because they belong in all the clusters, you can't build clusters off of them. They're pretty much, they're worthless. Sorry, don't tell your siblings I said that. Actually, I think I should tell my siblings I said that.
All right, Irma on Zoom. On Ancestry DNA matches, I have lots of matches where Ancestry thinks I'm related on both sides. I also have lots of matches where Ancestry doesn't indicate mother's side or father's side or both sides. How do I handle these?
So I think, if Ancestry is trying to mark a mother or father because of the parents taking the DNA test, if they're showing up in both, then that could be a sign that there are some double relationships where, you know, these people are related to both your mother and your father through different lines, not meaning your parents are related, but kind of like I was showing with those, you know, cousins that married each other.
Mhm.
You know, mom's cousins married dad's cousins. So that could be a possibility. I'm not exactly sure why some of them don't get marked as mother's side or father's side. It might just be that Ancestry, the way the algorithm works, it just can't determine in that. But that's why building your clusters from scratch and kind of setting aside what Ancestry is telling you will actually probably help you sort some of that out.
All right. Deborah on Zoom, how do you open the zip file from MyHeritage auto clusters?
That is a really good question. And I don't remember what I just did because I just did auto clusters and it worked fine. Ask me another question, and while you do that, let me pull up the file I got from MyHeritage and see what it looks like.
Okay. Is it something you can just open in your file explorer?
You probably
it's
have to extract it.
Okay.
Actually, you don't. At least for me, when I'm looking at it, I got 3 files. I got an Excel spreadsheet. It's within, you can just open the zip file like normal. You might have to extract it like Brandon said, but you open it. I got 3 files. One is an Excel spreadsheet and one is an HTML file. The one you actually want to play with, and it's kind of counterintuitive, is the HTML. Because the HTML has the one that's got the pretty little things. The other one's a spreadsheet that's not, doesn't have color, isn't as exciting.
Okay.
I like color, so but yeah, so if you want to see kind of what I showed you, if you're not seeing 3 files in that zip file, then you might not have gotten the correct thing, and you might want to try submitting for another report from MyHeritage.
Mary suggests in the chat that if you click on the file that shows the HTML file, that it will open automatically.
Okay, awesome.
Great. Sharon on Zoom. So what happens when your husband, oh, this is another endogamy, sorry. Joan on Zoom asked, can we share a copy of your pedigree chart with the colors you used? Can we put that up on the wiki?
We can. I also linked to one that was put together by, I think it was, I think it might be Leah who did that one. I put a link in the wiki of another variation of that.
Okay.
I've seen a lot of variations of that. I chose to go the opposite. Usually people make the dad's side the green side or the blue side and mom's the pink, and I flipped them just because I wanted to. So, I mean, but there's a couple out there, but yeah, I'll see that in the fan chart. Somebody's asking for the fan charts. We'll see if we can put those up on the wiki, maybe during lunch, and get those out there.
Awesome. Jackie from Facebook, how do you address clusters when you have matches? Oh, that's another endogamy.
Yeah.
Beverly on Zoom, what is the likelihood of 4th to 6th generation Cherokee ancestry showing up in DNA results?
In terms of ethnicity, very, very, very slim.
Okay.
There's an article I read, and now I'll have to see if I can track it down and add it to the wiki, once about why Native American just doesn't tend to, at least North American Native American doesn't tend to show in DNA results. It has to do with a combination of factors. A lot of the tribes were more wiped out, but one of the big ones is that they don't trust DNA testing. I mean, if we talked about having reference samples in order to actually, you know, in order to do comparisons, we need to have people do testing for reference samples. The people who are Cherokee are worried that if they test, then somebody will claim that they are not Cherokee and it will impact their tribe status or other things like that. So they are not very excited about DNA testing. So I think getting reference samples for those groups is going to be very difficult.
Okay. Judith on Zoom asks, I have just 440 matches with the highest match at just 99 centimorgans. Do you think it is worth me using these matches to explore my tree further?
I think any match can help. I'd be curious to know, you know, think about what DNA company you tested with. If you have, you know, we were talking a little bit earlier about the fact that people in other countries are not as excited about DNA testing. And I hate to say excited, but it's just not really caught on. Or, you know, Debbie was mentioning there's a financial issue in some countries. So if you're coming from a country, if your parents were immigrants, if you're here in the United States or you yourself live somewhere else, the problem is just mostly that there's not enough other DNA testers out there. So in that case, you might consider something we call targeted testing, where you say, well, I need more matches. I need something. So I know my mother came from this little town in, Poland, in modern day Poland, and I'm going to go back and I speak Polish, and I'm going to take 20 DNA kits with me and see if I can get some people to help me out. So there's some possibilities there, but when you're not seeing a lot of matches, I find that it's usually because the locations of your ancestors, there's just not a lot of people testing yet. So you could put it on the hold for a while and come back to it, or you might just, jump in, see what you can do with it, play around, get your clusters built. Even with 400 matches, you're going to have clusters. And maybe it's not helpful right now, but 10, 20 years down the road, it might be that country, something happens and they all start taking DNA tests. So
yes,
just don't know what's going to happen.
She might want to also consider, uploading to GEDmatch and sharing with MyHeritage, just getting it out in more places. That might help as well.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Get your DNA. I mean, I've got my DNA with all 5 companies, and I think there's benefits in having it out there in many places.
Okay. Dana from Facebook asks, searches can be done on locations. Is there a way to figure out what names are in that location?
So it depends on the DNA company. I don't know exactly the flexibility of, for example, of Ancestries or any one company. Usually you can filter either, you can search by location. You might be able to search by both. You might try it out, see what you can do with the search parameters for that website.
Okay. Michelle on Zoom, when trying to find unknown paternal ancestors, do you have to have known maternal ancestors? For example, grandma's dad was an orphan from Italy. Her mom's side is all living in Italy.
So it's a good question. The real truth is that even if you can't really find you don't have any known matches on your mother's side, you should still be able to build 2 clusters, and you just have to then say, okay, that really, once I've built the 2 clusters, or I built the however many clusters, that one's clearly a maternal cluster because, it's, everybody on it has these large Italians. And I know that this other cluster, nobody has Italians. So I'm assuming that this other group is paternal. So you can build just as if you were an adoptee and you're building paternal and maternal. You can build a bunch of unknown clusters if you don't have somebody to start with. It's nice to have somebody to start with, but if you don't, you can still build the unknown ones.
Okay. How long are we doing Q&As?
I think we're going for about 15 minutes. So.
Okay, we're getting close. We can do a couple more. Okay. Jackie from Facebook, can a second cousin take the Y-DNA test?
Anybody can take a Y-DNA test as long as they're male. Are you talking if a second cousin who's the one who carries the surname and should be on the patrilineal line, then yeah. When it comes to Y, the Y mutates so slow, or not that it mutates slowly, but it's inherited virtually intact. So honestly, anybody that you can get to do the test is valuable. So even if it's a second or third cousin, if that's who you can track down and convince to spit in a tube or let you scrape their cheek, go for it. If that's, again, with the Y-DNA, whoever you can get is valuable.
All right, one last question. Xenia from Zoom asks, what type of endogamy would show a cousin match as my child or my parent when he is neither? It's totally impossible that he is.
That sounds like there's multiple relationships, and it might not be true endogamy in the sense that it's an isolated population. It might just be multiple relationships, and it could be that they're both like, I'm trying to think of a combination of, it could be that it's your brother on one side and nephew on another side, or I'm trying to think, but DNA kind of stacks. It can stack, meaning it can, sometimes when you're working with double relationships, you have to look at the total number of centimorgans between the 2 potential relationships. So I think there are possible relationships. That's one, again, where you'd probably want to schedule a consultation and we would take a look at it a little bit closer and see if we could figure out what's going on there.
All righty then. Thank you, Beth. That was fantastic. Just a few reminders. This class was live streamed and will be available immediately on the Family History Library's Facebook page for a limited time. The class will also be added to the DNA Basics Learning Center on Roots Tech. If you need help with a specific research problem, please sign up for a virtual consultation with one of the library's research specialists. We would really love to help you. The next class will be at 1 p.m. Mountain Time using DNA to determine relationships, but don't forget about our Facebook Live event with Johnny Pearl starting at noon.
Enjoy your lunch, everybody.